I'm the Commodore of the Bennet Yacht Club. This is episode 3 of how to build a Bennet boat. In this episode, we're going to finish the hull, cover it with epoxy, put on the deck, and make the keel. When we left off last time, we hadn't finished the keel part of the boat's spine. So that's what we're going to do now using one of our Sureform files. So earlier we drew this center line on the pine, and when we file the keel now, we just want to make the edges of the keel come to that center line like that. And that also includes the bottom right here. Okay, the next step is to cut out a piece of plywood for the deck. I'm going to use this plywood right here. We're going to trace the boat onto the plywood. And cut it out on the bandsaw. This is just a scrap 1/8" plywood. You can get 1/8" plywood at Home Depot and various places. And you don't have to cut it very exactly at this stage. We're just going to glue it on and we're going to trim it to the edge of the hull later. So we've got our hull all shaped and we filed the keel into a nice hydrodynamic foil. We can't go any further until we've covered the hull in fiberglass and epoxy. That's the main strengthening component of the hull. This is the fiberglass. This is 6-ounce, regular 6-ounce fiberglass. You can get it at a boat yard or marine supply store. You can also get it at an auto supply store where they sell it for patching bodywork. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to cut strips of fiberglass, all different lengths and shapes, about enough to cover the boat. You can cut fiberglass with just about any pair of scissors, but I would recommend getting a pair that you don't mind throwing away after a few boats, because the fiberglass itself dulls the scissors pretty badly. And when you're cutting, don't pull hard with scissors because you'll pull the fiberglass apart. It's pretty delicate until it's embedded in epoxy. Let's say a word about epoxy. I use West System brand epoxy, but there are many other brands that you can use. Epoxy has a resin, and then it has a hardener, and in the West System epoxies there are two kinds. This is slow hardener. Takes a sort of an overnight period to harden. This is fast hardener. It takes a few hours, couple hours. These are fillers that you can add in order to get your epoxy to have certain characteristics that you want it to have. I'm going to stir it up before applying it. I'm going to cover the entire hull in a coat of epoxy. Note that I've put down a layer of heavy paper under this because epoxy is such a mess. I'm going to start with these long strips. I'm going to put these down near what will be the gunnel or the shear line. Pat the fiberglass and stretch it till it forms itself to the shape of the hull. You want to have a little bit of overlap between the wooden component and the foam and between the layers of fiberglass. But try to avoid too much overlap, because that increases the weight of the boat and the thickness of the epoxy, and it changes the shape of the hull that you very carefully built up. This is called wetting out. And you want the fiberglass to be wetted out. It changes color. Like any fabric, when it gets wet, it'll change color a little bit. You can see how the fiberglass fibers are coming off on the brush as I work. And you want to try to minimize that. More dabbing and less painting. You can't avoid it entirely, and that's okay. You can clean those off later. It's just easiest to minimize it now. And when you're wetting out the epoxy at the end, it can be a little hard to deal with the little tiny pieces and the bits of fluff that come out off of it. But you want to keep tapping away with the brush and getting out as much of the air pockets and bubbles as you can, because those change the shape of your hull away from what your original intent was. It's a bit of a mess up here at the bow, but don't worry about that. We're gonna probably just trim all that off later. When you're done, throw away your brush and your gloves. You can clean your scissors with acetone so that if you've got epoxy on those, they aren't permanently ruined. And then let everything sit overnight until the epoxy hardens up. Welcome back. 24 or 48 hours have passed. The epoxy's nice and hard. We're ready to get on with our boat building. Just a warning to you, before you start to work on the boat at this stage, there's nothing sharper than epoxy covered fiberglass. There are lots of little threads coming out of our epoxy job here, and each one is a tiny little needle. So be very careful when you're working on it until you've had a chance to sand it all over and knock those edges off. Be careful, it's really sharp. Okay, let's get it off the paper and see how it came out. Looks good. Let's get this cleaned up. For the first rough sanding on our new fiberglass job, there are a bunch of different ways we can go. This is just 60 grit sandpaper wrapped around a wooden block. This is just a sanding disc attached to a cordless drill. But, in case you can't tell by my safety equipment, I'm going to use this palm sander with 120 grit sandpaper. Let's get going. When you clean up this extra glue along the deck, you want to be sure that you don't have any bumps like this. So using a combination of the disc sander and actually an angle grinder, I have cleaned up the fiberglass and epoxy all over the boat, including the deck. I've reestablished the shear, gotten off all of the excess epoxy except a little bit here where it's helping to even everything out. And we're ready for the next step, which is actually to remove we're going to remove some of this styrofoam in the middle. It's going to help lighten the boat. We don't really need it anymore now that it's fiberglass. You don't have to be delicate with this. The only thing you want to do is stay away from the gunnels and away from the turn of the transom here, because you still need this to help establish the shape. But all of this middle stuff can come out. I'm just using a painter's knife to do this work. You can use any hooked tool. That ought to about do it. You want to make sure you get all the bits of styrofoam, loose bits of styrofoam out of the hull, or once you get the deck on, your boat's going to rattle. Don't forget that tip from before. You can just spray yourself with water and the styrofoam brushes right off. The next stage is attaching the deck. Here's the piece of wood that we cut out earlier, and we're just going to need to glue it onto the boat. But remember, the shear of the boat is curved, and so if you just glued it on, you'd have this gap. If you held it on like this and let the glue harden, you'd get a single curve here. But remember, our shear has a little bit of reverse in the bow, and then a regular shear here and a little bit of reverse at the stern. So we're going to have to glue it in stages. What I found works best is to glue the bow first and let that harden, and then glue the rest, and I'm going to actually tie it together with ropes to hold it together while the glue hardens. But let's get that bow glued on first and go from there. A little 5-minute epoxy should be all we need. Okay, so the epoxy's hard. I clamped it like this. There it is. What we're going to do now is I'm going to prop the deck up like this, and I'm going to use a popsicle stick to spread epoxy in there.
Well, I didn't show you the mess of clamps and ropes I used to tie the deck on while the epoxy hardened. But there it is. Now, the next step is to put the lead on the keel. Lead is critical because it keeps the boat upright when the wind is blowing on the sails. But it also weighs the boat down and makes it go slower.
The weight of the lead is going to go down here somewhere. The lower it is on the keel, the more leverage it'll have to hold the boat upright. So that means you might want to put the lead all the way across the bottom. The problem is that the center of buoyancy of your boat is about here. So if you put the lead across the bottom of the keel, the boat is going to float down at the stern. Now, a little bit down at the stern is okay, because when the sails are pulling on the boat, they tend to pull it over onto its bow a little bit. But you don't want too much, because that's going to change the way the water flows over the hull. So you want a little bit forward like this. I'm thinking lead something like this. Now that we've got the location for our lead marked on the keel, we're just going to cut it out with a coping saw. There, that ought to do. This is lead flashing. It's used for roofs and chimneys, and you can buy it at any good building store. Not at Home Depot, I said a good building store. It costs about $4 a pound. So we're going to roll it out here, and we're going to trace the chunk of the keel that we just cut out onto the lead a bunch of different times, and then cut those out. Okay, I've cut out 11 pieces of lead in the shape of the wood for the keel. And just for our own information, let's see how much weight we have here right now. 1 pound, 1.5 ounces. All right, let's get this trimmed up. Got our handy dandy Sureform file. Here we are. Just a little bit of back and forth with the rasp, and it's ready to go in. We're just going to tack it in with some 5-minute epoxy, and then we're going to fiberglass it in once that's hard. The last step is to put some fiberglass going from up on the keel, on the lead keel, all the way down to the hull, down to here. So just gonna okay, and we'll just mix up a little bit of epoxy and get this put right on there. I've thickened this epoxy with a little bit of colloidal silica, which is an additive that makes it a little thicker and a little less runny. And that's just to help hold it against the side of the keel, which is vertical right here. So it's a little harder to work. Okay, we haven't put the transom on yet, so I'm going to mix up a little bit of 5-minute epoxy with some filler here. This is low density fairing filler. West System sells it in these tubs. It makes the epoxy thicker and able to fill voids. It also makes it easier to sand. Now I'm just going to stuff this epoxy into the crack here at the aft end of the deck that we've installed. And I've put a bevel on the deck here with an angle grinder. And I've got this piece of decking material here, and I'm just going to shove it in there like that. I've cut a bevel on that too, also with the angle grinder. Okay, while you were away, I finished gluing down this piece of deck on the transom, and I sanded it smooth so it's going to have a nice even transition with the main deck. And I used this sanding block just to take the tops off of the lumps of fiberglass here where we attached the lead for the keel. We're really at the last stage of hull construction. We're going to frost the boat. Wait till you see this. For the last step, I'm making up some epoxy. This is 10 squirts on the West System pump. And once it's all stirred, I'm going to add some of this low density fairing filler. Now it's really bad to breathe this dust while it's still in this form, so I'm wearing a mask. This contains colloidal silica, which is probably not too good to breathe. So And I want a consistency like cake frosting. Not yet. I think I'm going to add a little bit of this straight colloidal silica just to thicken it up a bit. It's this weird white powder. Okay, we've got our gloves on. We've got our chocolate frosting. Now the reason we want chocolate frosting is because we are going to frost the boat. Get a big glob like this and just frost the boat. And then when you get down to the edges like this, just want to smear it right onto the seam between the deck and the hull. That helps to tie the two together. And there we have it, a frosted boat. I think you can start to understand the parameters you need for the epoxy. If it's too thin, it'll run off the boat before it hardens. If it's too thick, it'll leave voids, which are going to be holes in the surface of the hull once you've sanded it. Or it leaves these big peaks, and that's just a lot of sanding that you're going to have to do later. But this looks pretty good, so we're going to let it set up for 24 to 48 hours till it's good and hard, and we're going to sand it in the next episode.